Welcome everyone, this is Caesar, your host for Inspire Movement. Today we are incredibly excited to be hosted at the Timucua White House, part of the Timucua Arts Foundation, and we're going to be kicking off a series entitled Music and the Arts. Today we're joined by my friend and instructor, Dr. Sam Desmet, who is a European guitarist who has toured the world essentially doing solo performing and the likes. And here we find ourselves in this beautiful place, very inspiring and intimate setting, and so glad that you take out of your busy schedule to do this. So thank you so much. I'd like to start with that.
Sure.
I'd also like to allow for maybe a little brief intro, anything that you want to share with our audience in terms of your personal background, just anything at all that you think is a good intro to the rest of our interview together.
Sure. So I'm a classical guitarist, originally from Belgium, moved to the US, I'd say about 10 years ago. Obviously, in relation to studying music, I did my doctorate here. Decided to stay here. I liked it a lot. I liked the music scene in the US, very different than back in Belgium. Different, not necessarily worse or better, just different. And yeah, up until now, I'm still doing music. So yeah.
Wonderful. So I think for a lot, this is a kickoff, as I mentioned before, to a series on music and the arts, and I think I'd like to use it for an advocacy of music and the arts, particularly here in the U.S., where I feel that there's a little bit of a lesser focus on that from a curriculum standpoint in schools. When would you say that you were discovered, I guess, your passion for music, and then more specifically, your passion for the classical guitar?
Well, it's a little bit different with classical guitar because I noticed, talking with a lot of colleagues of mine, also classical guitarists, very often they start off with, with that idea of becoming the new Jimi Hendrix, right? You get together with a couple of friends, you bought a cheap electric guitar, just kind of fooling around pretty much. But I kind of vary from very early on. I'd say about like when I was 12 or 13, I hit a wall because I didn't really understood what exactly what I was doing. Like for example, I didn't know anything about music theory or technical things when it comes to playing. So I decided to enroll in the academy, which is back in Belgium, is run by the government pretty much. Which has a set curriculum. Now it's a little bit different because now they do offer jazz and popular music, but back then it was only classical music, so I had no choice. I was just enrolling into classical. So back then, again, today is very different, but you had to do 1 year of solfege, one year of music theory before you could even start. And then after that 1 year, obviously a lot of kids don't like to do that, but somehow I knew after that 1 year I could finally start with music. So then I finally got this, guitar lesson, and I remember I had like a very old guitar. I was like 40 years old, from my dad, basically. Terrible instrument, but I managed to play on that instrument for 3 years, and then I discovered something that I wasn't, even aware of, basically. That classical guitar has a lot of things to offer that I simply wasn't aware of when listening to any kind of music. So it really changed me the way I listened to music because of my very basic back then still, music theory and just playing and going through different kinds of repertoire, different composers. So yeah.
So you mentioned the academy. This would be, say, what would be equivalent to the high school level here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I started with high school, but basically what this is, it's a system that is set up by the government that you can start with when you're turning 7, and it's all the way up until you're 18. But I mean, you can enroll in any given moment, but it's kind of like an after-school kind of program. So most kids do it on Wednesday afternoon, or during the weekend on Saturdays. But since I was fairly old, I was 12. I decided to start with the adults. I was the kid in the adult class, right? but and you know the funny thing about that is that I remember the first week of classes, one of my college students, an adult person, told me, he was like, "Hey Sam, you know, there's still a chance for you if you want to become a professional musician." And I was like, I'm not gonna do that. This is purely for a hobby. But then, yeah, every year it got more and more serious. I spent more and more time doing that, and I realized, hey, this is a big part of my life. Maybe I should consider doing that. And then by the time I turned 19, after high school, I did something completely different. I went into informatics, but then the music virus was still there, and yeah, I picked it up again, and then I did my audition for Conservatory, and then yeah, we went from there.
Okay, well, that's a great segue for our next part of the or sequence of questions. So again, this is intended for advocacy, and we may have some aspiring students that watch this video for the first time, music students, maybe folks that want to pursue it not only from an academic setting, but do something to the point that you've done it, which is professionalize it by becoming a soloist and touring, etc. Um, the Royal Conservatory in Belgium is, I believe, your next step, right? After you had the little stint with the informatics. Can you tell us a little bit about the rigor of a music curriculum at a Royal Conservatory, or conservatory in general? And in studying your CV or your bio leading into this interview, I also learned that your focus of study was on music performance, one, but also a term that I was unfamiliar with, but maybe you can clarify for all of us, music pedagogy. And if I'm mispronouncing that, please excuse me. It's entirely new to me, but I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, I did normally. Well, normally before you go to the conservatory, you're supposed to go through the entire track of from 7 year old up till 18, and then you do your audition going into the conservatory. However, because I started fairly late and I started with the adults, I kind of went through a shorter, kind of program. But then I did audition, and the audition requirements back then was playing, doing some music theory, and an interview. And the funny part, I mean, I didn't think it was that funny back then, but the interview was half an hour with, I remember, which will then become my professor for music theory. And it was 25 minutes completely telling me that I shouldn't be doing music. Just to kind of, I guess, to kind of give me a feel like how serious is this guy actually about doing music? You know, how much is he willing to give up, or how much is he willing to invest? And I shouldn't say give up, but how much is he willing to invest? But what I said earlier in the interview, I already did 2 years. I worked for 2 years in a completely different industry while I was still playing music, and I was very dedicated, and I was convinced I could turn the guy around, and at the last 5 minutes he was like, well, okay, I guess there's something inside of you that really wants to do this. Maybe we should give you a chance. And then I did the music theory, the audition, which was pretty hard for me. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I struggled at the beginning a lot with music theory, partially because I didn't have as much of a background as most of my college students at the conservatory had. But they gave me a chance, and I noticed throughout my career at the conservatory that I always tend to focus on three things the most, which is obviously my instrument, guitar, music history, which I had an incredible, very knowledgeable professor. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but I still remember those moments. He had a very heavy accent, and at first it threw me off, but very quickly that changed because he had so much knowledge, even about my instrument, that I wasn't completely aware of. So music theory, and then music history, and then music theory was at the beginning very, very, very hard because I was competing with musicians that went to the Russian school. They studied music since they were 3 years old. Both of their parents, have a professional career. And I remember I was terrified at the beginning, but very dedicated, and I kept on working. And I had throughout my career as a student, I had what people might see or what I saw, some failures. I had some roadblocks that were pretty hard to swallow. But I knew actually very soon that that's what I wanted to do, and I kept on going, and eventually I made it. And ironically now, I'm actually teaching music theory at Valencia College, and that was my first roadblock. You see, so but again, to go back to your question, I think music theory, history, and and performance are the three pillars, I should say, that are where the whole curriculum is based on. And then of course you have electives and things like that. I mean, choir, for example, wasn't an elective, but I know some programs do require you to do choir. I know, for example, in the US, it's not required. It's a little bit different, which is, going to be then the next step once I decided to do my doctorate here. I very quickly noticed the change in focus in curriculum compared to what I was used to.
So that, again, a good segue to my next question. Let's start with a critical part of your journey, which is obviously you were born in Belgium, schooled in Belgium, musically as well. What prompted you to consider the United States for your next steps, I guess would be more generally the question, but then even more importantly, to go full into academia and now take it to a PhD in music at Florida State University, as far as I understand it, right? Tallahassee. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more maybe about the whys and how did that all happen for you?
Sure. So again, it's still going back to the very beginning where it all started. I had this very, fast track leading into, doing the conservatory. And then I realized once I graduated with a master's that I still wanted to explore so much. I remember having this conversation with my instrument teacher back then. When I went from bachelor's degree into a master's degree, I said, so what's actually the difference? What is the difference in focus? And he says, well, if you're doing your master's, you kind of have to maybe start thinking about, really focusing on a particular composer or a particular time era, doing history and focus on that. And it was kind of, I was kind of shocked by that, actually. I was like, really? I feel like I have to explore so much still. Like, I don't want to narrow down. I'm curious. I'm from nature on, I'm from nature out, very, very curious person. So I want to keep on doing that. I want to keep expanding that. And that happened even after my master's, too. I felt like I don't have, I'm no longer enrolled in school, and then you have to do everything by yourself, which is also kind of a struggle at the beginning. But then I started exploring, and I ended up in Germany in one of the bigger festivals for guitar, and I was intrigued by the American school, if you can call it like that. That there's a lot of players in there that have a very progressive way of playing, very innovative way of playing, very new approaches to repertoire. Things like that, and that was very new for me. So I ended up talking with a professor over there that eventually became my main professor at Florida State University, and I remember playing for him, some kind of like a pre-audition, I'd say, and I played half an hour music, pretty hard music actually. I remember I actually played music that was way too hard, realizing now. And I remember playing the last note, and he just stood up and he left. And I was like, that's it. I blew it, like, forget it. This is never going to work. Whatever. I'm just going to do my own. Yeah, right. So, but what I didn't realize then is then in the evening, so many hours later, there was this cafeteria there where everybody was kind of gathering at the end of the day. And he came up to me and he gave me a list of repertoire and pieces that I should practice, that I should benefit from, and and I was like, oh wow, this guy all this time has been actually, reflecting on what he heard in that half hour and kind of mapped out at least, or give me some direction that I can use. And then I was like, maybe I should consider studying with him. Now the thing is, what I said earlier about the conservatory versus the doctoral program in the US, we don't have. Well, again, now it's changed, but back then we didn't have a doctoral degree in arts. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna try and do official audition at Florida State to study with this guy, Bruce Holtzman. And but I didn't have the intention of really getting that doctoral degree. For me, it was just, I was a sponge still. Like I just wanted to absorb as much, right, absorb as much as I can, the knowledge, and I just wanted to play and learn. And I was like, okay, if I run out of money, that's it. I'm gonna go back to Europe and do what I'm doing right now, which was I was already teaching at the academy when where it all started for me. But then after one semester, I believe the dean walked in and he said, "You need to come to my office." I'm like, "Whoa, wait, am I in trouble?" But then he said, you should sign this paper. And I'm like, what is this paper? And he's like, well, this is a waiver and a scholarship for completing your doctorate because we saw you play and, I talked to your main professor and we want you to stay to finish the program. So I was lucky enough to get the financial needs for that. But then something else happened. I mean, I got married here.
Big step.
Yeah, it was another, obviously a good reason to stay, right? But yeah, I enjoyed the program and yeah. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely gives us a lot of reasons, not only for you to migrate, having met this future professor of yours in Germany, as I understand it, right? But also, more importantly, to stay. So
Right.
we're very glad that you stayed.
Right. Thank you.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have met, right?
Right.
And find ourselves here. So with that, I'd like to transition from your academic pursuits to now just more generally. I know we've had many a conversation when we were still having the in-person instruction at the academy, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But can you mention maybe some of your musical influences? I know we talked at some length about Leo Brouwer, which obviously I had not heard of before prior, which is a travesty in and of itself. But can you share a little bit about your influences in music?
Sure. So, I mean, you mentioned Leo Brouwer. Obviously, for most classical guitar players, that's like the one guy that you can't go around. Everybody at some point during his career as a performer is playing, going from his simple etudes to, sonatas and larger works. This guy is for me particularly very interesting, and not just for me, for most players, because he has his background is, I mean, he's a Cuban composer, so he has influences from different cultures. I mean, in his music, if you listen to his music, there's African rhythms in there, there's South American influences, of course, but it's one of the very few Cuban composers who also dedicated quite some time in studying abroad. He studied in New York. He traveled a lot too, so and you can hear all of those influences, even not just talking to him, but just really studying his music. You hear all those different facets that he had gathered and knowledge that he gathered throughout his life. I mean, very very knowledgeable person, and I was lucky enough in my last year at the Conservatory in Belgium to work intensively with him for an entire week. And what really struck me actually back then was he wasn't talking that much about guitar. He was talking about music. Like he was talking about expression. He was talking about this is the idea behind what I wrote over here, and this is what should come forward, and this should be a little bit more in the back, and this is the overall form of this. And so he was doing analysis, and he was actually including references to literature, architecture, many different things, and it made me realize that he was probably one of the very first ones that made me realize that I had to explore different art forms too, and that music very often had parallels with different things in life. So Leo Brouwer, for sure, one of the biggest influences in my career, I'd say. Um, but there's many. I mean, I just feel as I grow older, it just depends when you're asking me that question, you know. I always feel like anytime when I'm learning a new piece from a composer I've never played before, I try to listen to as many pieces from that same composer, guitar pieces or non-guitar music. And then very often I end up reading articles or reading books, or you know, if I'm physically able to travel to a particular place where the composer worked or is you know, having references in his music to particular places, I try to visit them, or at least read about it. And I just realized it's a constantly moving thing. So it's very hard to answer that question and pin down a few. Sure, I can give you a few names, but that list is extremely long and is growing
It's
almost
ever expanding, you would say.
right.
Yeah.
It's almost on a daily basis. It's almost growing, you know. Even just as a person, it doesn't have to be necessarily music related. You know, we met in person. You have a different background than me, and I found that fascinating. You know, the more I grow up, or the older I get, the more I realize that I get inspiration outside music too, through social interaction, through you know, traveling is another thing. You know, my wife is from Asia, and I've visited Taiwan a couple of times. I performed there too, and it's such a great different experience, and different people with different cultures, and it blows my mind every single time that traveling is giving me so much inspiration, but also makes you realize how humble people should be actually about that, you know. And that's another thing. I noticed the people that have the most influence, like for example Leo Brouwer or Alvaro Pieri, which is a performer, a great performer that I really admire. All of those people, for me, they are like, you know, I really look up to those guys for so long. And when you met them, they tend to behave on the same level. They're just human. They're just humans as anybody else. Of course they are. But it's just like, you know, you study so hard, and you go into these details about music, and then you finally meet the person that actually contributed to or gave you a lot of inspiration, and you realize, then you get answers like, yeah, but I'm asking them questions like, how do you approach new music? And then they're like, well, I mean, I don't know. I still feel I'm fairly new at it. And then they've been doing it for 40 or for 50 years. And they say, well, I'm just trying. And at first I was like, I don't get it. Like you're so much more advanced. You have so much more maturity in your playing than I do. And you get an answer like that really makes you realize, like, everybody's just, as a performer or as a person, is just trying to contribute, you know, just trying to explore and trying things, and action and reaction, basically, you know.
So it's almost like it's almost more important the pursuit thereof than the destination.
Absolutely.
It's the journey that you're really uh, holding on to more so than I need to be this guy by this time.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, especially as a performer, this is very true. I mean, that's the paradox. I mean, we talked about it during our lessons a few times, but it's like this constant. I mean, when I was younger, I felt like the whip effect, you know, like, oh, I gotta study more, I gotta do more and more, and like you feel like you're drowning, but you're at the beginning, you're really focusing, or at least as a younger player, you're really focusing on that very moment of being on stage, and this is it. This is your one chance to make it work. While doing it for a couple of years now, I just realized that, like you said, the journey is 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 important. I mean, if you don't do the journey, the destination, I'm not going to say has less value, but it contributes to the value of the destination, the journey itself. And it's important to go through that. There are, in music especially, I mean, I can only speak from my field, but there are no shortcuts. You can't say like, okay, I'm going to practice this way, and it's going to save me time. That guarantee that's never going to work. Maturity is, in a sense, something very important when it comes to that. Doing it many times in many different ways, not necessarily, doing the same thing over and over. Because like in my language and in French, rehearsing, they call it répéter, which means repeating. But repeating is good only in a way if you absolutely know what you're doing is an efficient way to do it. And that's maybe the psychological way of playing. But I realized by growing older, your efficiency or your focus on how to practice changes a lot. And by going back to that répéter, right? A lot of people are, there's this famous saying that practice makes perfect. It's only partially true, I feel, because I mean, if you practice the wrong way, if you're repeating over and over, but you do it the wrong way, your brain eventually is going to see that as the right way to do it, because it's used to that process. But if the initial process that you started was done inefficiently, then of course, I mean, once you're on stage or so you have to realize that, and as a younger player, you're especially if you're in your teenage years, you're physically in great shape and no struggles whatsoever. And if you do have a struggle, it's like usually full force against it, like usually very physical. And it's funny, a friend of mine, René Izquierdo, who's also a Cuban a guitarist, he said, the older I get, the more I feel the easier the guitar becomes. And at first I was like, really, again? Like I started laughing, I remember. But then he started explaining, like, yeah, it's mainly because I let go. I let go instead of like, when something is hard, people tend to like tense up, while actually relaxing or really looking at it from a distance and just really understanding things helps you with that. And I feel you only get there by by not just necessarily by knowledge, but also by experimenting, and very often bumping your head, very often actually.
So one of the aspects that I like to explore from your, again, biography is your willingness to explore, right? So we've alluded to it before in some of the things that you've already mentioned, but you partook, and I don't know if this is something that you're actively doing, in what I understand is a chamber music duo. If I'm saying that incorrectly, please correct me. I found it interesting, the name as well. Maybe you can elaborate on that. But I believe it's Wabi Sabi Duo. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and how did that add more color to your already pretty expansive musical palette, as I call it?
Sure. So about the duo. Well, first of all, maybe I should explain what chamber music is. So chamber music, unlike orchestras, where you have multiple different instruments together, but like for example, if you look at an orchestra, you have a violin section, you have a cello section, you have a wind instrument section, and very often, or actually most of the time, like if you focus on the violins, there's maybe 10 violins or more that play the same notes on exact the same, with the same rhythm, exact the same moment. Chamber music, in a sense, is different because chamber music, each instrument or each player that is involved is having a unique voice, having unique rhythms, unique harmonies if they're capable of playing harmonies, they have their uniqueness, and that could be a guitar duo, or that could be a string quartet where, like for example, if you take a guitar quartet, if you have 4 guitars, that doesn't necessarily mean they all play the same notes. They all have an individual part that is different from each other. That would be true chamber music. Now, if all those 4 guitarists are playing exactly the same notes, then technically speaking, that
At the
isn't
same tempo, almost
right.
in synchronicity.
Exactly. Then that isn't chamber music because you're doubling what we call voices. So to elaborate on the Wabi Sabi duo, so Wabi Sabi duo is a guitar flute duo that started. I actually have to think back. 2011 or 12, somewhere around there. When I was after I graduated from Florida State University, I moved to Miami because back then my girlfriend, who is now my wife, studied at the University of Miami. Tallahassee isn't really necessarily the most exciting place music-wise, so I figured moving to Miami. And then I was again exploring the local scene, and then I ended up talking with Emilio Rutland, who is a flutist from Chile, and we formed the Wabi Sabi duo, which is basically exploring guitar, flute repertoire, very often repertoire that is underexplored. And most of the time we're focusing on repertoire, I'd say about the last 100, 150 years. And there's a reason for that, but I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole here. And just to give you an idea about wabi sabi is a Japanese term that kind of gives a worldview of accepting the incomplete, accepting the things that are constantly changing, which is certainly true for musicians. And that not just only focuses on music, but focuses the wabi-sabi effect is kind of accepting those changes and imperfections in oneself and in themselves, and also in life in general. It's part of life. The imperfections are part of a perfect life. And I start to accepting that again more and more. As if you're young, everything is shiny and everything is amazing. But of course I'm positive that everything in life has its purpose, but it very often sometimes it is not as perfect as you would think it is. But if you see the overall thing, you tend to accept that, and growing older, I tend to accept it more than I was accepting when I was I don't know, let's say 14 or something like that.
Okay, so as we continue down our series of questions here, you've mentioned previously already being a faculty or having been a teacher at the community college here in Orlando. Music theory, guitar, among other classes, I believe. I'd like to kind of co-join this with another question that I was meaning to ask. First of all, elaborate a little bit on that experience, teaching now collegiate students, some of them with musical backgrounds, some of them not. I would presume for things like music theory. But again, going back to that diversified experience, right? As a perpetual student in music, and the arts for that matter, as you mentioned, looking for other influences for inspiration, as a performer, as well as a teacher, which one of and as a composer, actually, I forgot to mention that as well. So tell us, what has that brought to that already expansive palette, the art of teaching music, which is not easy. Teaching somebody like myself, an adult student with no prior background, surely is different than a collegiate person at the community college, or maybe even an aspiring student that is 6 or 7 years old. What dimensionally, what has that added to this palette of yours?
Well, for me, teaching, performing, and I mean, you call it composing, and for me, it's a new kind of experiment because back then, out of necessity, but I'll might talk about that later. But teaching and performing is intertwined. It's connected with each other because I feel the things that I explored and learned throughout my career, or the knowledge that I gathered, as not just necessarily as a musician, but as a person too. I'd like to, kind of um, use that knowledge to train other musicians, or to inspire, I should say, inspire other musicians to avoid things that I've been struggling with for a while, the roadblocks. And of course, I mean, I can't avoid everything because again, different person, different background. Um, but I do also, and on the other way around too, by teaching, I realize that, like for example, the other day, I was explaining something to a student of mine, and I couldn't understand why a particular right hand issue, why I couldn't have this fixed with this student, no matter what I did. So what I decided to do is I kind of explored all my students and see how they react to that particular instruction or this particular piece, and how they deal with that situation. And then I started dividing my class in the can do and the cannot do, and why. And then I start seeing structure, and eventually I understood why, because I saw the small differences that eventually led to the solution also for me.
And
It's
if you don't
not
mind me
sure.
interrupting, I'm wondering, does that add value to you as a performer yourself, where maybe dissecting certain mental blocks that, these musicians, whatever age they're in, are stumbling upon, uh, you know, getting them over that hump? Has that process helped you
For
at all?
sure. I mean, I've been teaching since I started at the conservatory, and yes, I mean, different people react differently to the same instruction, and some benefit more than others. And so for me, it's a question like, how come this works with this person and it doesn't work with this person? And then you realize, well, actually, this person is responding differently because his hands are different, or the repertoire that he'd done before has an influence on where he is right now, and that teaches me as well that I should explore things that I haven't thought about. I mean, again, it's a different person with a different background. It's not because you're half my age or double my age that I can't learn. And the thing, actually, I realized that very quickly when I remember um, when my grandma was still alive. She said at some point something that I told her, and she says, "Well, I'm glad that I can still learn from you." And for me, again, it was like one of those moments, like, wow, you're like 4 times my age, and you telling that you're still learning from me. I was Because if you're young, you always assume that people that are much older, you know, you can't teach them anything anymore. They've been through life much longer than you, uh, so I automatically assume. But it turns out not, actually. And that's I'm getting excited. I get excited more and more of teaching, exploring, and it teaches about myself too because of that process.
Share with us, please, a little bit about Lake Nona Music Academy, which is where I met you.
Hmm. So Lake Nona Music Academy is a business that I started together with my wife, who's a classical pianist. We both, usually in the morning, we both teach at the Valencia Community College, and in the afternoon, if we're not practicing, we are teaching. It's a one-on-one kind of setup. Teaching just, I mean, if we have to, well, not have to. If the student shows interest, we can also go uh, towards the route of music theory and composition. But yeah, it's a one-on-one instruction setup, and then we have normally, well, now it's a little bit different because of the situation, of course, but normally we have one recital each semester, and we're also enrolled in some kind of a federal music club organization that kind of gives a opportunity for the students to perform in front of another person, a jury, so they get feedback, which is also, I think, an interesting concept, to have feedback from a different person. Again, I tend to, being me, I tend to, give feedback from my experience. Getting feedback from somebody from outside the box is very interesting, and it's for that reason why we do that. And we seem to be doing, I don't want to advertise too much, but we seem to be doing pretty well. I never expected that, again, because I grew up in a very different system, and the academies back in my home country. I didn't have that one-on-one kind of private business thing. And that's something that is very new, very interesting to me, is that the American system, music education, compared to Europe, is that I remember when I was a kid, because I paid for my education throughout, even though I was only 13 or 14, I collected my money from a summer job, and I remember, I think it was like $160 a year for music education, which is, compared to what we're charging for a one-on-one session, is complete out of whack. But of course, the whole system in Europe is, higher taxes, etc. I don't want to go too much into that. And sometimes that really, it plays with me, because I know if you have a system that is funded by the government, it is cheaper, and everybody has access to that. And I know in the US, it's not always the case. Just look at the education system over here. Very, very often, it's probably one of the first things they cut,
And that basically leads us to our wrap-up question for today's interview, because we want to have the sheer joy of listening to you play for at least a few minutes, a few pieces, if you will. But that takes us pretty much full circle where we started, which is, again, we want to use this forum as an advocacy for the music and the arts. We're consumers because we love it from in all its elements, really. Listening, dancing, viewing, all of the different elements that music and the arts brings about. You mentioned the differences between Europe and the United States. If you could just sort of tell us what you see as a detriment for the child developing, essentially, in this country or any country that has a lesser value on music and the arts, and possibly a much higher value on technology and, say, the hard sciences. All of these things are important, as we know. But when you take away this whole aspect of music and the arts, how are we cheating our youth in that manner by making it less accessible? Just some quick thoughts on that as we wrap up.
Sure. So, in my opinion, I think education, obviously, very important. If you ask me, music and education is crucial in a sense. I believe the power in that is that music, physically, first of all, you're physically involved in moving fingers, fine motorics, things like that. You're also involving different senses, looking at the score, very often memorization as well. Audible, of course, things like that too. But it goes further like that. I feel like the things that I've explored as a student and now as a teacher with my students, and analyzing particular things, is not only reflecting again in music and the things that they study in my sessions with them, but I realized, doing music throughout all of these years, it made me explore different things outside music that, the skills that I gathered by studying music can very often be reflecting in other things, or problem solving, teamwork if you do chamber music or orchestra. And like, for example, like the business that I have now too with my wife too. I've never done a business. It's very interesting. You learn new tasks, and very often I tend to rely on the skills that I gathered by studying music. So yeah, it is very crucial, I think, as a development as a kid. And about 100 years ago, it was mandatory. You know, it was as important as math. And I get that. I really understand why that is. So it hurts me when I see programs getting cut for whatever reason it is, but I don't get it, honestly.
Well, with that, we're going to segue into now again our viewing or our listening pleasure by allowing you some space and time to play for us. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Desmet, for taking time out of, again, your busy schedule to join us in this conversation. I know that we both enjoyed it, and I'm sure the folks viewing it will as well. I'm sure many an aspiring student, maybe somebody already immersed in the profession, just to be able to connect. And I think that's so important in every vocation, is just the ability to connect. And I think that's what the YouTube channel and social media platforms that we all have can be useful to us, right? And with that, I'd like to thank Mr. Benoit Glazer and the Timucua Arts Foundation for allowing us to film in this beautiful, inspirational space. One little personal plug or plug for Mr. or Dr. Desmet. I know there's going to be a rebroadcast of a performance that you did as well here in a few days, I think November the 13th. Please tune into that. And thank you so much. I think we'll conclude now and move on to some playing. Exciting stuff.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. So thank you guys for tuning in to another segment of Inspire Movement. So very glad that you could join us for this beautiful segment with Dr. Sam Desmet. As we kick off our series on music and the arts, we will be expanding on this a repertoire of artists and musicians as we continue forward, and we look forward to having you join us. We ask that you please subscribe to our channel, Inspire Movement channel, as we will continue having a great community outreach with local leaders, and in this case, musicians and artists, which I'm sure you're bound to want to get to know. We also want you to follow us on other social media platforms that we're in, Instagram and Facebook. Please follow us and like us there, as we will also have pertinent content for you as well there. Again, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a great pleasure, an honor, and a privilege, and we look very much to hearing from you in the future. Thank you so much.